"Nobody picks the quiet girl," Cora Donnelly said, and her voice did not shake, which was the worst part of it. She said it the way a person states a fact about the weather, or the price of flour, or the distance between two towns on a map. She said it standing in the middle of Haverfield's General Store in Dusty Creek, Texas, in the spring of 1882, with 3 women from the church auxiliary watching her from behind bolts of calico, and Clarence Doyle standing 6 feet away with mud on his boots and his hat in his hand, staring at her like she had just said something that cracked the floor open beneath them both. He had come in to buy rope and salt, and he was leaving with something entirely different lodged in his chest. She had not been speaking to him. She had been speaking to Mrs. Haverfield, who had been asking, in that particular prodding way that women in small towns have perfected over generations, whether Cora had any prospects, whether anyone had come calling, whether she had thought about what her future might look like now that her father was gone, and the little schoolhouse where she taught was the only thing standing between her and complete destitution. Cora had set down the tin of baking powder she was holding, turned to face Mrs. Haverfield directly, and said it plainly. Nobody picks the quiet girl, as if she had long since made peace with this truth, or had at least decided to stop pretending otherwise. Clarence felt those words like a branding iron pressed to the inside of his ribs. He did not say anything then. He paid for his rope and his salt, nodded to the room at large, and walked back out into the glare of the Texas afternoon. But he did not go home. He stood by his horse for a long moment, squinting out at the flat brown horizon, and something shifted deep in his understanding of how the next part of his life was supposed to go. To understand why those words struck him so hard, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of that day, but the beginning of what had brought them both to that particular moment in that particular store, which is a longer and more complicated story, and one that involves a great deal of heartache before it arrives anywhere worth arriving. Cora Donnelly had come to Dusty Creek, Texas, in the autumn of 1879, when she was 22 years old, and her father, Patrick Donnelly, had decided that his lungs were failing him, and that the dry air of West Texas might buy him another year or two. He was a schoolteacher from Missouri, a gentle and bookish man who had never quite fit into any of the places he had lived, and Cora was very much his daughter in that regard. She was not plain, though she believed herself to be. She was not shy in the way that people sometimes meant, which was to say timid or lacking in opinion. She was simply quiet. She moved through rooms without demanding attention. She listened more than she spoke, and when she spoke, she said exactly what she meant, which unsettled people more than they liked to admit. Her father had lasted 3 years in the dry heat, which was better than the doctor in Missouri had predicted, and in that time Cora had taken over the teaching duties from him gradually, first helping, then leading, until she was running the small schoolhouse near the edge of town almost entirely on her own. When Patrick Donnelly died in January of 1882, she buried him in the little cemetery on the hill west of town, collected the money she had saved from her teaching wages, and sat down in the empty house to figure out what came next. What came next, as far as Dusty Creek was concerned, was that Cora Donnelly was now a single woman of 25 with no family, no land of her own, and a job that paid $30 a month during the school term, which was not enough to cover rent on the house when the term ended, and the town's generosity ran dry. The women of the church auxiliary had opinions about this situation. The men of the town had opinions too, though theirs were mostly the kind that got expressed in sideways looks and uncomfortable silences rather than outright conversation. Nobody came calling. Cora had expected this, and she told herself she did not mind it, which was partly true and partly a lie she had gotten good at telling herself. She was not the kind of woman who got picked for things. She had understood this from an early age. She was not the first one chosen for the spelling bee team, not the one the boys in Missouri had competed to carry books for, not the one who got asked to dance at the town socials. There was always someone louder, brighter, more obviously present. Cora existed in the spaces between those women, and she had made a quiet life in those spaces, and it had been enough, she told herself. It had been enough. Clarence Doyle had come to Dusty Creek in 1875 at the age of 27, which made him 34 in the spring of 1882. He had come from Colorado, where he had worked cattle drives and learned everything there was to know about land and livestock, through the kind of hard experience that leaves a man's hands permanently scarred and his eyes permanently careful. He had purchased a modest plot of land south of town with money he had saved over 8 years of working for other men, and he had spent the next 7 years building it into something that other men now referred to as the Doyle Ranch, which was a real thing, with cattle and horses and 2 hands he employed year-round, and 4 more during roundup. He was not the richest man in the county. That was Harris Beaumont, who had arrived in the region with capital already established and had been adding to it ever since in ways that Clarence did not entirely trust, but had never been able to prove were dishonest. But Clarence was comfortable and honest and well-regarded, and people in Dusty Creek would have told you that he was a good man without needing to think about it very hard. He had been married once briefly in Colorado before he came to Texas. Her name had been Ellen, and she had died of fever in the winter of 1874, 8 months after their wedding. He did not talk about this. He had carried it quietly for 8 years, the way he carried most things, which was deep and without complaint, and it had made him into a man who was gentle in ways that sometimes surprised people who expected hardness from a cattleman. He had not remarried, and the reasons for this were his own business, though the women of Dusty Creek had theories. He was particular, some said. He was still grieving, others said, which was probably closer to the truth. He was waiting for something specific, which he himself could not have fully named until the morning he walked into Haverfield's general store for rope and salt, and heard Cora Donnelly say 4 words that told him more about her than 100 conversations could have. Nobody picks the quiet girl. He went home that evening and could not stop thinking about it. Not the words themselves, though they stayed with him, but the way she had said them, not with self-pity, not with anger, with a kind of steady, matter-of-fact acceptance that he recognized because he had once felt something similar, that particular settling of the bones that happens when a person has decided that certain things are simply not for them, and has made their peace with it and closed the door. He had closed a door like that himself 8 years ago when he buried Ellen. He had not expected to want to open it again. He had been wrong about that, apparently. He thought about Cora Donnelly. He thought about the way she moved through the store, quietly and precisely, without wasted motion. He thought about the fact that she had taken over her father's school and kept it running through grief and financial difficulty without asking anyone for help, which he admired deeply. He thought about her eyes, which were dark brown and direct and entirely unimpressed with pretense. He thought about all of this for 3 days, and on the 4th day he went back to town. She was at the schoolhouse when he arrived, which he had known she would be because it was a Tuesday morning in April, and the school term was still in session. He stood outside for a moment and listened to her voice through the open window, reading aloud to the children from a geography book, and something in the rhythm of her voice made him feel very still inside. He knocked on the door frame and the reading stopped and she appeared in the doorway, and the look on her face when she saw him was carefully neutral, the look of a woman who has trained herself not to expect things. "Mr. Doyle," she said. "Miss Donnelly," he said. "I apologize for interrupting your class. I can wait if you have a few minutes when you break for noon." She studied him with those direct eyes of hers. "What is this about? I'd like to talk, if that's acceptable to you." She considered him for a moment, and he had the uncomfortable feeling that she was reading something in his face that he had not quite meant to show yet. Then she said, "I break at 12. You can wait on the bench out front if you like." He waited on the bench. It was a warm April day, and the smell of spring grass came across the open land from the south, and he sat with his hat on his knee and thought about what he was going to say. He had not done this in a long time, this particular kind of conversation, and he was aware that he was likely to be clumsy at it. At noon, the door opened, and the children poured out into the light, and Cora came out behind them, untying her apron. She sat down on the other end of the bench and looked at him with an expression that suggested she had already prepared herself for something she was not going to like. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "I heard what you said in the store the other day, to Mrs. Haverfield." Her expression did not change, but something tightened slightly behind her eyes. "I'm sure that was not meant to be overheard." "No," he agreed. "I imagine it wasn't. I'm not bringing it up to embarrass you. I'm bringing it up because it's been sitting with me for 3 days, and I think I need to tell you something." She waited. She was very good at waiting. "What you said," he said, choosing his words carefully, "I don't believe it's true. And I'm not saying that the way a person says something polite to make someone feel better. I'm saying it because I've been watching you operate in this town for a while, and I think you have a very mistaken idea of your own worth." The silence that followed this was different from the waiting silence. It was the silence of someone who has been handed something unexpected and does not quite know where to put it. "That's a fairly bold statement from someone I've exchanged perhaps a dozen words with," she said. "I know it is," he said. "I apologize for the boldness. I've been told it's a failing of mine." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that neighborhood. "What is it you want, Mr. Doyle?" "I want to take you to supper," he said. "At the hotel dining room, next Saturday if that suits you." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see the calculation happening behind her eyes, the weighing of possibilities, the search for the hidden motive, the trap, the joke at her expense that she had learned to brace for over the years. He understood that calculation. He let her work through it without rushing her. "Why?" she said finally. "Because I'd like to know you better," he said. "Because I think you've been underestimated, and I find that interesting." "You find underestimated women interesting," she said flatly. "I find you interesting," he said. "The underestimation is just the thing that made me say so out loud when I might otherwise have kept quiet about it." Another silence. A crow called from somewhere above them, and one of the children shouted from behind the schoolhouse, and the spring wind moved through the grass. "All right," she said. "Saturday, the hotel dining room." He put his hat back on and stood up. "Thank you, Miss Donnelly." "Don't thank me yet," she said. "I have a great many opinions and very little patience for wasted time. You may find the evening considerably less pleasant than you're anticipating." "I sincerely hope so," he said, and left her sitting there with that almost smile turned fully into the genuine article, though she waited until he had walked far enough away before she let it happen. She spent the rest of that week telling herself that it meant nothing, that it was likely to be awkward and brief, and that she would return to her house afterward, and that would be the end of it. She had been on the receiving end of charitable attention before, from men who thought they were being kind by including the overlooked woman in something, and she had learned to recognize that particular flavor of pity and had learned to dislike it. But Clarence Doyle had not looked at her with pity. He had looked at her with something that she could not quite identify, which was unusual because she was generally very good at reading people. It kept bothering her all week, the fact that she could not place the expression on his face when he had sat beside her on that bench. She pressed her second-best dress and put on the earrings that had been her mother's, and on Saturday evening she walked to the hotel dining room and found him already there, waiting, in a clean shirt and a jacket that he had clearly made an effort with, and when he stood as she came in, she noticed that his hands were folded in front of him with a patience that did not look performed. They sat across from each other at a table by the window, and the waiter brought them water and a menu that they both studied for a moment. And then Clarence set his menu down and looked at her and said, "How long have you been teaching?" she told him. He asked follow-up questions that were not the polite surface questions but the actual questions, the ones that showed he was listening to what she said and thinking about it. She told him about her father and about Missouri, and about what it had been like to take over the school and make it work on her own terms. He listened to all of it and did not once look over her shoulder at the rest of the room, which was something she noticed because it was unusual. When it was his turn, she asked him about the ranch. She had heard things about it, the way you hear things about anyone in a small town, but she asked him to tell her himself, and he did. He talked about cattle and land and the particular satisfaction of building something that was genuinely your own. He talked about the years in Colorado and the cattle drives. He did not mention Ellen, and she did not ask, because she had heard the broad shape of that story from others, and she understood that it was not the first evening kind of conversation. What he did say at one point, leaning slightly forward with his elbows on the table in a way that she found unexpectedly endearing, was, "What do you want? Not what you think you can get. What do you actually want?" She sat back slightly because the directness of it surprised her. "That's a remarkable question," she said. "I'm a fairly direct person," he said. "I probably should have warned you." "I appreciate direct," she said. And then, because she had decided to be brave about this, she said, "I want to be somewhere that fits me. I want to teach for as long as there are children to teach. I want a home that belongs to me, not a rented house I might lose at the end of any given school term. I want—" She stopped. She was not accustomed to saying this next part out loud. "I want to be someone's first choice. Not a backup, not a kindness, an actual, genuine first choice." The quiet that followed this was a different kind of quiet than any of the previous ones. It was the kind that holds something inside it. "That seems like a very reasonable thing to want," Clarence said. "Most people seem to find it aspirational for someone like me," she said, and there was an edge to it that she hadn't fully intended. "Someone like you," he repeated, and the way he said it was not agreeing with the premise. "What kind of person do you think you are, Miss Donnelly?" She looked at him directly. "Quiet," she said. "Unremarkable, the kind of person who blends into the wallpaper." "I've been watching you for 4 days," he said, "and I haven't once managed to stop thinking about you. That does not strike me as wallpaper behavior." She did not know what to do with that. She picked up her water glass and drank from it and looked out the window at the dark street, and when she looked back, he was still watching her with that expression she hadn't been able to place, and she finally identified it. It was the expression of a man who has made up his mind about something. That was the night that everything began to shift. They had supper again the following Saturday, and the one after that, and by May the town of Dusty Creek had opinions about this development, as it had opinions about everything. Some of those opinions were expressed directly to Cora, mostly by the women of the church auxiliary, who seemed to believe that she needed to understand the full dimensions of what she was stepping into. "He's been alone a long time," Mrs. Haverfield told her, with the tone of a woman delivering a warning. "Men who have been alone a long time can have complicated habits." "I expect so," Cora said, and moved on. "Harris Beaumont has shown an interest in you as well," Mrs. Pruitt mentioned, in a tone that was meant to make Cora feel flattered by the comparison. Harris Beaumont was 49 years old, had buried 2 wives, and had a reputation for treating his cattle better than his household. Cora thanked Mrs. Pruitt for the information and felt nothing about it whatsoever. What she felt, which was a considerably more complicated situation, was that something she had carefully contained for a very long time was beginning to leak around the edges. She felt it on the evenings when Clarence came to the schoolhouse after her class ended and walked with her back through town, not because she needed an escort, but because he seemed to genuinely enjoy the hour of walking and talking. She felt it when he brought her a book from a traveling merchant's wagon, a collection of essays by a woman writer from the East, because he had remembered her mentioning that she loved essays. She felt it when he laughed at something she said, a real laugh, not the polite kind, and the sound of it moved through her like warm water. She was falling in love with him. She understood this, recognized it with the same steady clarity with which she understood most things, and she did not particularly trust it. She had been careful for so long. She had built such careful walls. The trouble with Clarence Doyle was that he was very good at walls himself, which meant he recognized hers and did not try to knock them down by force, but instead simply sat beside them and waited, patient and steady. And over time this was considerably more effective than force would have been. In late May, a complication arrived in the form of Harris Beaumont. Cora had known Beaumont by sight and reputation for as long as she had been in Dusty Creek, but she had not had much direct dealings with him because his world and hers did not often overlap. He was a large-scale cattleman and landowner with political connections and considerable influence in the county, and she was a schoolteacher, and those two types of people did not generally move in the same currents. But in late May, Harris Beaumont came to the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon and waited for the children to leave, and then presented himself in the doorway with his hat in his hand, and an expression that he clearly believed to be charming. "Miss Donnelly," he said, "I wonder if you have a moment." She had a moment. She sat down behind her desk and folded her hands and waited. Beaumont was not a stupid man, but he was a man accustomed to being received with considerable deference, and Cora's lack of it seemed to throw him slightly. He seated himself in one of the student chairs, which was too small for him, and crossed his thick arms and looked at her with eyes that did calculations. "I'll be direct with you," he said. "Please," she said. "You're a capable woman in a difficult position. Your employment is seasonal, your housing is uncertain, and you have no family to fall back on. I have a large house that's been run by a housekeeper for 7 years and a name that carries weight in this county. I'm proposing that we make an arrangement." Cora looked at him for a moment. "An arrangement," she said. "Marriage," he said. "A practical one. I'm not a romantic man. I'm offering you security and position, and in return I expect a well-run household and a wife who can receive guests appropriately. I'm told you're educated and well-mannered, which suits my purposes." The silence in the schoolroom was very still. Outside, a dust devil moved across the yard and dissolved. "Mr. Beaumont," Cora said very calmly, "what you have described is not a marriage. It is a business contract in which I provide labor and social credibility and receive a salary in the form of housing and a last name." He looked startled. "I wouldn't put it that way." "I know you wouldn't," she said, "but that is what it is, and I'm not interested." He studied her. Something shifted in his expression, something less charming and more calculating. "You're currently walking out with Clarence Doyle," he said. "That's not your concern," she said. "I'd advise you to think carefully," he said. "Doyle is comfortable enough, but he doesn't have the kind of position I have, the kind of security, and frankly, Miss Donnelly, you're not in a position to be turning down serious offers." She stood up, which was a clear invitation for him to do the same. "I appreciate you being direct," she said. "I'll return the favor. I would rather teach school in a rented house for $30 a month for the rest of my life than enter into the arrangement you've described. Good afternoon, Mr. Beaumont." He left. She sat back down behind her desk and noticed that her hands were trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the compressed force of keeping her voice level through that conversation. She sat there for a while, looking at the dusty windows and the rows of empty desks, and then she gathered her things and went home. She did not tell Clarence about this visit immediately. She was not sure why, partly because she was still figuring out what it meant, and partly because she did not want to involve him in something that was ultimately her own business to handle. She had been handling her own business for a long time, and she was not in the habit of distributing it. But Dusty Creek was a small town, and small towns have their own information systems, and within 3 days Clarence knew that Beaumont had been to see Cora. He did not know what had been said, only that there had been a conversation, and the fact of it sat in him like a splinter, not quite painful but impossible to ignore. He came to walk with her on Friday evening as he often did now, and they walked toward the edge of town where the land opened up and the evening light turned the grass gold, and after a while he said, "Beaumont called on you." "He did," she said. "What did he want?" She looked at the horizon for a moment, and then she told him, plainly and completely. She watched his face as she did it, and what she saw there moved through several stages, starting with something careful and ending with something that was not quite anger but was adjacent to it, controlled and held flat but present. "And you sent him away," he said. "Of course I did," she said. "You didn't have to tell me," he said. "You know that, right? It was your business and you handled it." "I know that," she said. "But you were going to hear about it eventually from someone, and I'd rather you heard it from me." He nodded. They walked for a while in silence, and then he said, "Beaumont is going to be unpleasant about this." "Probably," she agreed. "He's not a man who accepts being turned down gracefully." "I gathered that," she said. "I want you to know," Clarence said, and his voice was careful but direct, the way it always was when he was saying something that mattered, "that whatever comes from this, I'm not going anywhere. If he makes things difficult for you, I want to know about it." She stopped walking and looked at him. The light was amber and long across the grass, and his face was very clear in it, and for a moment the careful, controlled space she kept around herself felt very thin. "Why?" she said, and she meant it more broadly than just the present moment. He looked at her steadily. "Because I have feelings for you that I'm fairly certain you're aware of," he said, "even though I've been trying not to press them on you faster than you're comfortable with." "You're right that I'm aware of them," she said. And he said, "And," she said, and her voice was very quiet, "I have corresponding feelings that I'm trying to be sensible about." "What does being sensible look like?" he said. "It looks like not trusting good things too quickly," she said. "It looks like being afraid that this is something that will make sense for a while and then stop making sense, and I'll be left having let down my guard and feeling foolish." "I understand that," he said. "I've felt that." She looked at him. "Ellen," she said. It was the first time she had said the name, and she watched something move across his face, brief and deep like a current under still water. "Yes," he said. "You don't have to talk about it," she said. "I know," he said, "but I want to if you want to hear it." They sat down in the grass at the edge of the town in the long evening light, and he told her about Ellen. Not all of it, but the shape of it. He told her about the marriage and the 8 months, and the fever and the way grief had made him into someone who carried everything alone for a very long time, because it felt safer that way. He told her about coming to Texas and building the ranch and slowly, over years, finding his footing in a life that was good even if it was not quite complete. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like she was wonderful." "She was," he said. "And this, what I feel now, it's not the same thing. It's not lesser for being different, it's its own thing." She understood what he was doing. He was being careful about her, telling her that what existed between them was not a replacement or a consolation, but something genuine and present. She appreciated it more than she could say. "I'm not good at this," she said, "at letting people in. I've always been too far back in the room, watching. It's hard to be in the center of something and not feel like I'm in the wrong place." "You're not in the wrong place," he said. "I know that feeling," she said. "I do not necessarily believe it yet." He reached over and took her hand carefully, asking permission with the slowness of the gesture, and she let him, and they sat in the grass watching the sun finish going down, and something settled between them that was different from before. Something that had been approximate became exact. That was the beginning of the second complication, which arrived approximately 2 weeks later and turned out to be considerably more serious than Harris Beaumont's bruised pride. It came in the form of a letter. Specifically, a letter to the town board from a state education office in Austin, noting that funding for small rural schoolhouses was being reviewed, and that schools with fewer than 15 enrolled students were at risk of closure as part of a broader consolidation effort. The Dusty Creek School had 11 enrolled students. Cora heard about this from the board chairman, Mr. Aldrich, who came to see her on a Monday morning with the apologetic expression of a man delivering news he wishes he did not have to deliver. He explained the situation clearly and without cruelty, which she appreciated. The school might close at the end of the summer term. If it did, the children would need to travel to the larger school in Ridgewood, which was 12 miles away, and Cora's position would be eliminated. She thanked Mr. Aldrich for telling her directly, and she sat very still in her chair after he left, and felt the floor shift under her in a way that was entirely interior and entirely real. This was the dark place beneath the dark place, the part she had not let herself look at directly. Without the school, she had nothing in Dusty Creek to keep her there. Her rent was tied to her income. The house she lived in belonged to the Haverfield family, and they had been patient, but they were not a charity. Without a salary, she could not stay. Without a reason to stay, there was no reason not to leave, and she had nowhere else to go. There was no home in Missouri anymore, no family, nothing but the address of a cousin she had not spoken to in 4 years. She spent 2 days being very quiet and very private about this, which was her custom with catastrophe. And then she told Clarence. She told him on their Wednesday walk, the one that had become as regular as rain by now. She told him the same way she told him everything, directly and without drama, stating the facts of the situation and then waiting to see what he would say. What he said was, "Tell me what you want to do." "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still figuring out the shape of it." "Do you want to fight it?" he said. "I want to keep the school open," she said. "I want those 11 children to be able to learn where they are instead of being sent 12 miles away. Whether I fight it or not, that's what I want." "Then let's figure out how to fight it," he said. She looked at him. "This isn't your problem." "You're my—" He stopped. He started again. "You are someone I care about a great deal, and what matters to you matters to me. If you'll let me, I'd like to help." She was quiet for a moment. Letting people help was the hardest thing. It required trusting that the help was genuine and that it did not come with a cost she hadn't been told about. She had been burned by help before, the kind that came with expectations and strings and the quiet assumption that accepting it meant owing something unspoken. "All right," she said. "How?" He thought about it. "The issue is enrollment," he said. 15 students. You have 11, 4 more. Families don't move into a small town because a school needs students," she said. "No," he said. "But there are 4 families I know of on ranches within reasonable riding distance who have children of school age. The Calloway family has 3. The Murphys have 2. The Vasquez family has 2 children who I know for a fact have no schooling because I've spoken to their father about it. That's 7 potential students if their parents will send them." She stared at him. "How do you know all this?" "I'm a rancher," he said. "I know my neighbors." She was quiet for a moment, running the numbers. 7 would put us at 18, she said, well above the threshold. "You need to talk to those families," he said. "Explain the situation. Some of them have reasons they haven't sent their children yet: distance, cost of materials, the sense that schooling is optional when there's ranch work to do. Those are arguments I can help make. You would go with me to talk to these families." "If you want me to," he said. "Some of them will listen better to me because they know me. That's an honest fact, and I'm not happy about what it says about the world, but it's useful right now." She thought about that. He was right. The Vasquez family in particular, she knew, had faced enough suspicion and exclusion from certain Dusty Creek residents that they might receive a female schoolteacher from town with wariness. But if Clarence Doyle came with her, a man they knew and trusted, it would be different. "Yes," she said. "I'd like you to come with me." What followed was 2 weeks of weekend rides out to the ranches and farms within a reasonable radius of Dusty Creek, Cora and Clarence side by side on horseback, visiting families and talking about education. It was, without either of them fully acknowledging it as such, a remarkable education in each other as well. She watched him with the Vasquez family, how he spoke to Eduardo Vasquez in a tone of plain respect, and listened carefully to the man's concerns about whether his children would be welcomed in a town school, whether they would be treated fairly, whether the other families would cause trouble. She watched Clarence take those concerns seriously, not dismissing them or offering empty reassurance, but promising specifically and clearly that if anyone in that town mistreated those children, he would consider it his personal business and act accordingly. Eduardo Vasquez had looked at him for a long moment and then looked at Cora and said, "You will teach them fairly." I will teach them exactly as I teach every other child in that room, she said. Their names, their history, their language are welcome in my schoolhouse. After they rode away from the Vasquez ranch, Clarence said, "You meant every word of that." "Of course I did," she said. "I just want you to know," he said, "that watching you say that was one of the finest things I've seen." She looked straight ahead at the trail. Her face was warm and it had nothing to do with the sun. By the end of those 2 weeks, they had commitments from 3 of the 4 families. The Callaways sent 2 of their 3 children, the eldest being needed on the ranch. The Murphy children were enrolled outright. And Eduardo Vasquez, after a second conversation in which he brought his wife Maria, and she asked Cora 3 very precise questions about curriculum and discipline, agreed to send both his children beginning in the fall term. That was 5 new students, bringing the total enrollment to 16, which was enough. Cora went to Mr. Aldrich with the numbers and the signed enrollment cards, and he examined them carefully, and said he believed this would satisfy the state requirement, and he would write to Austin accordingly. She thanked him and walked out of the town hall and stood on the wooden sidewalk in the afternoon sun, and felt something in her chest ease open like a fist finally unclenching. Clarence was waiting for her at the bottom of the steps. He had not come inside, understanding instinctively that this was her victory and the presenting of it should be hers. He looked up at her face and read the answer there before she said a word. 16, she said. He smiled, and it was the full kind, the kind that used everything. She had catalogued his different smiles by now, which told her something about how deeply she had been paying attention. This was the best one. "Come to supper with me," he said. "It's 2 in the afternoon," she said. "Then come for a ride with me first and then come to supper," he said. "I want to celebrate." She went for the ride, and then she went to supper, and it was the best evening she had spent in a very long time, and somewhere in the middle of it, over plates of roasted chicken and a bottle of wine that Clarence had procured from somewhere, and presented with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had put more thought into it than he wanted to admit, something final tipped into place inside Cora Donnelly. She was in love with this man. Not carefully, not with qualifications, not hedged around with the self-protective doubt she carried everywhere. Fully and clearly in love with him, the way she had told herself she was too plain and too quiet and too much of a wallpaper person to be. She did not say this. She was still Cora, and Cora processed things in layers, and she needed to sit with this knowledge for a while before she did anything about it. But when he walked her home that evening and they stood on her porch in the dark, and he said good night with an expression that told her he was fighting the impulse to kiss her and winning the fight out of a deep respect for her pace, she reached up and put her hand against his cheek for one brief moment. He went very still. "Thank you," she said. "For the school, for coming with me, for all of it." "You did the work," he said, his voice lower than usual. "You came with me," she said. "That mattered." She went inside and closed the door and leaned against it in the dark for a moment, and outside she heard him stand on the porch for a long breath before his boots moved off the steps. Harris Beaumont had not forgotten about being turned down. Small men with large opinions rarely do. In July, when the school question had been settled and the summer term was winding down, and the whole town seemed to be settling into the heat in its own comfortable way, Beaumont made his move. It was not a dramatic move. It was the kind of move that happens in offices and in casual conversations on the street, the kind that leaves no fingerprints but causes real damage. He went to see 3 of the board members individually. He mentioned, in a concerned and civic-minded tone, that he had heard some things about Miss Donnelly's situation that perhaps warranted attention. Her housing arrangement was month to month. Her financial position was precarious. And there was the question of her relationship with Clarence Doyle, which was becoming quite public, and was it really appropriate for a woman in charge of the children's education to be conducting what amounted to a courtship in the open streets of the town? He was careful. He did not say anything that was a direct lie. He simply arranged existing facts in a pattern that suggested Cora Donnelly was unstable, or reckless, or somehow not the right sort of person to be shaping children's minds. Two of the three board members were sensible enough to hear this for what it was and dismiss it. The third, a man named Wentworth who owed Beaumont a considerable amount of money from a land deal the previous year, took the concern seriously enough to raise it at the next board meeting. Cora heard about the board meeting from Mr. Aldrich, who was apologetic and clearly uncomfortable, and she felt the familiar chill of having had the ground shifted under her by someone else's calculation. She sat across from Aldrich and listened carefully and asked the right questions, and by the end of the conversation she understood exactly what had happened and exactly who was responsible. That evening she told Clarence. She was very calm about it, which worried him more than tears would have. He recognized that particular kind of calm because he felt it himself sometimes, the calm that is not peace but compression. "Beaumont," he said. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and the quiet had an edge to it. "I'll go and talk to him." "No," she said immediately. He looked at her. "Cora, no," she said again, more firmly. "If you go to Beaumont and make this a confrontation between the two of you, it becomes a fight between two men about a woman, and I become incidental to my own situation. I will handle this. I am asking you to let me handle it." He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him working through it, the instinct to protect fighting against the understanding of what she was asking and why. He was a man who had grown up in a world that told men to handle things, and he was making a genuine effort to see past that, and she respected him deeply for it. "All right," he said. "Tell me what you need from me." "I need you to let the board members know that you stand by me," she said. "Not by confronting Beaumont, just by being plainly and publicly clear that you trust my judgment and my character. Your reputation in this town carries weight. I'm not too proud to use that." "You have it," he said, "without reservation." She went to each board member herself, individually, the next day. She was direct and unruffled, and she presented herself as what she was, a competent professional with a solid teaching record and the documented support of 16 enrolled families, including families she had personally recruited. She did not mention Beaumont by name. She did not need to. She made the picture of her competence so clear that the shadow Beaumont had tried to cast on it simply had nowhere to take hold. Clarence, for his part, made a point of being seen in conversation with the two sensible board members in the days that followed, and what he said to them he said in the straightforward way he had of speaking, that Cora Donnelly was the most capable and trustworthy person he knew in Dusty Creek, and that anyone who suggested otherwise was either poorly informed or had a personal reason to undermine her that had nothing to do with the children's education. Wentworth, the third board member, visited Beaumont a week later and told him that the matter was not going anywhere, and he would appreciate it if Beaumont did not put him in that position again. Beaumont received this news with the controlled fury of a man who is accustomed to getting what he wants and is not going to stop wanting it, but there was nothing more he could do at that moment without making his motives obvious to everyone. The school was safe. Cora's position was safe. And the incident had one additional effect, which was that it brought something into the open between Cora and Clarence that had been approaching for a long time. It was a Sunday in late July, and they had ridden out to the eastern edge of his property because he had wanted to show her the view from the ridge, which looked out across miles of open range with the sky taking up more of the visual field than most paintings can capture. They sat on their horses at the top of the ridge and looked out at it, and after a while he said, "This is my favorite place on the whole property." "I can understand why," she said. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, in the tone that meant he was going to say something that mattered. "About what I want it to look like." She waited. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that there is no wrong answer. If the answer is no, or not yet, or I need more time, all of those are acceptable. I'm not going anywhere, and I'm not going to stop feeling the way I feel. But I've been keeping this to myself for a while because I was trying to be patient, and I think I've reached the end of that particular patience." She looked at him. The sky was enormous and blue behind him, and the grass moved below them in long golden waves. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want you to be my wife. I want to build something with you that belongs to both of us, the ranch and whatever else we make of it. I'm asking you to say yes to that if you're willing." The air was very still on the ridge. Somewhere far below, a hawk turned slow circles in the heat. She thought about the girl she had been in Missouri, invisible in rooms, overlooked and adapted to it. She thought about the woman she had become in Dusty Creek, who had buried her father and kept a school running and faced down Harris Beaumont and his quiet campaign of sabotage without breaking. She thought about the last 6 months, the walks and the supper conversations and the rides out to neighboring ranches, and the way this man had watched her handle every hard thing that came her way with an expression of such specific, genuine admiration that she had not known quite what to do with it. She thought about what she had said in Haverfield's store in April. "Nobody picks the quiet girl." "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He looked at her, and the relief and the joy in his face were so plainly real that it made something behind her eyes ache. He reached over the distance between their horses and took her hand. "Cora," he said. "Clarence," she said, and the way she said his name was different from before, carrying all of it. They were married in October of 1882 in the little church on the main street of Dusty Creek, with the families of her 16 students in attendance and Clarence's 2 ranch hands serving as groomsmen and Mrs. Aldrich playing the small church organ with considerable enthusiasm. Cora wore a dress she had made herself from blue wool fabric that she had ordered from a catalog, because she was practical that way. But she wore her mother's earrings, and she did her hair differently than usual, and when she came down the aisle, several people later reported that they had not recognized her immediately, not because she looked different but because she looked fully present in a way that she had not always before, and the difference was striking. Clarence stood at the front of the church and watched her come toward him, and looked very much like a man who understood that he was witnessing something remarkable. The Reverend Morrison performed the ceremony without embellishment, which suited both of them, and when it was done, they stood together in the afternoon light outside the church door, while people they knew came by to offer congratulations, and Cora held Clarence's arm and felt the strange and unfamiliar luxury of being in the center of a room and not wanting to disappear from it. Harris Beaumont was not at the wedding. He had taken himself to San Antonio on business, which everyone understood to be his way of not being present without having to formally decline. He stayed in San Antonio for 2 months after that, and when he returned to Dusty Creek, Cora and Clarence were settled at the ranch and his window had closed entirely, and he seemed to understand this, because after that he was merely civil when their paths crossed, and that was the end of it. Cora moved into the ranch house, which was larger than she had expected and required a period of negotiation between its existing habits and her own, but they approached this negotiation with the same directness they brought to everything, and it resolved itself without serious conflict. She kept a shelf of books in what became the sitting room. He cleared space in the study for her marking and lesson planning. The house began to accumulate the particular quality of a place where 2 specific people live, with their combined tastes and needs expressed in the arrangement of objects and the use of rooms. She continued teaching. She had been clear about this before the marriage, and he had been clear that he supported it. And the reality of the arrangement was that she rode the 2 miles into town on school days and came home in the afternoons, and life ordered itself around this in ways that suited both of them. Some of the more traditional women in town had opinions about this, about a married woman continuing to work when her husband could support her, but Cora had grown expert at receiving people's opinions gracefully and then proceeding as she had planned to, and Clarence backed her up in this as in everything. It was a good winter. The cattle were healthy, and the winter rains were enough without being too much, and the school expanded to 18 students when 2 families moved into the county and enrolled their children without Cora having to recruit them at all. She and Clarence spent evenings by the fire with books or conversation, and there was a deep satisfaction to it that Cora had not quite let herself believe was available to her, this ordinary, extraordinary contentment of being in the right place with the right person. She told him one evening in February that she had been afraid of this, of the contentment itself. Afraid of being happy, he said, without judgment. Afraid of trusting it, she said. I kept waiting for the part where it makes sense for it to end, where the logic of my life reasserts itself and I'm back to being the person things don't work out for. He set down his book. What would I have to do to convince you that's not going to happen? Nothing more than you're already doing, she said. I think I'm mostly past it. I'm just telling you where I was. I'm glad you tell me things, he said. I'm getting better at it, she said. In the spring of 1883, when the bluebonnets came up across the range in their annual extravagance of color, Cora discovered she was expecting a child. She told Clarence on a Sunday morning when they were still sitting at the kitchen table with coffee going cold between them, told him plainly, as she told him everything, and watched his face move through surprise and then into something that was very clearly joy. He reached across the table and took both her hands. He did not say anything immediately, just held her hands and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the kind that she had learned to read precisely. It was the one that meant she was everything he had wanted and had not let himself hope for. "How are you feeling?" he said, which was exactly the right first question. "Fine," she said. "A little uncertain in the mornings, but fine." "What do you need?" was the next question. "Nothing more than what I have," she said. And then, because she was Cora, she added, "I'd like to keep teaching through the fall term if I'm well enough to do it." "Of course," he said, without hesitation. She did keep teaching through the fall term, though she handed the school over to a capable young woman named Miss Farrow in October, 2 months before the baby was due. She spent those 2 months getting the ranch ready in the quiet, methodical way she did everything, which Clarence found profoundly admirable and said so repeatedly. Their son was born in December of 1883, on a cold, clear night with a midwife named Mrs. Reyes, who had attended half the births in the county and handled everything with the brisk competence that Cora deeply appreciated. The baby was healthy and loud and had his father's coloring and his mother's direct gaze, and they named him Patrick, for Cora's father, which made Clarence very still for a moment when she proposed it, and then he said it was a good name, and she could see that he meant it entirely. Patrick Doyle grew into an excellent baby, meaning he ate and slept and made his opinions known clearly and without subtlety, which seemed to be a family trait. Clarence spent a remarkable amount of his spare time holding his son and talking to him about cattle and land management, which Cora found equal parts amusing and deeply touching. She watched her husband walk the porch at dusk with Patrick on his shoulder, talking in a low voice about the evening star and the way the light worked on the grass at that hour, and felt the particular warmth of knowing that the walls had come down all the way, on both sides, without either of them noticing exactly when it had happened. She went back to teaching in the spring when Patrick was 4 months old, and Mrs. Reyes's niece, a pleasant girl named Lucia, came 3 days a week to mind him at the ranch. This arrangement worked well. Cora came home in the afternoons and found Clarence often nearby, checking in on the baby with a casualness that was not entirely casual, and the evenings were the evenings she had come to love, full and steady and rich with conversation. Eduardo and Maria Vasquez had become friends, which was something that had grown slowly and genuinely from the school enrollment conversation and the Vasquez children's successful year in Cora's class. On Sunday afternoons, sometimes the 2 families rode out to visit each other, and those afternoons had the easy quality of people who have gotten past the surface of things and found something real underneath. The injustice of how the Vasquez family was sometimes treated in town was something that Cora raised at the school board when it came up in relation to the children, firmly and without apology, and Clarence backed her in this publicly, and in conversations with the ranchers and tradespeople he knew. It did not solve everything, but it mattered, and the Vasquez children learned in a room where their presence was unambiguously welcomed. In 1885, Harris Beaumont's financial situation deteriorated sharply. It came out, through the slow revelation that these things always eventually produce, that several of his land acquisitions had been structured in ways that were, if not strictly illegal, deeply exploitative, and that two of the families he had pressured into selling had grounds for complaint that eventually reached the county court. Beaumont sold most of his holdings and left the county, which he did quietly and without the fanfare of his arrival. Cora heard about it and felt nothing in particular, except perhaps a mild vindication that she did not need to express aloud. Clarence felt something more than mild vindication, but expressed it only by squeezing her hand once and saying, "Good," and that was enough for both of them. Life on the Doyle ranch settled into the rhythms of something built to last. The cattle operation grew in a measured way, adding land when it became available, and the timing was right, expanding the herd carefully rather than rashly, hiring 2 additional hands who turned out to be excellent workers and decent men. The ranch developed the particular character of a place that is well run by people who love it. Cora taught until the summer of 1887, when the Dusty Creek School District, now with 22 students and a solid state funding base, hired a second teacher, and Cora stepped back from full-time teaching to a part-time advisory role that suited her, enough to stay connected to the work she loved without being away from the ranch every day. She spent the extra hours doing things she had not had time for before, reading and writing, and expanding the kitchen garden into something that produced more than they could use, and supplied several of the neighboring families with vegetables through the summer. In 1886, their daughter was born, in a slightly easier labor than Patrick's, on a May morning when the whole ranch smelled of spring grass, and the cattle were moving through the south pasture below the house. They named her Alina, which was nobody's name in particular, just a name they both agreed was right, and she had her mother's dark eyes and her father's patience, and from a very early age the absolute certainty of a child who knows she is fully wanted. Patrick adored his sister with the passionate territorial affection of a 3-year-old who is deeply invested in a smaller person, and the noise level in the ranch house increased accordingly, and Cora and Clarence navigated this with more humor than either of them had expected to be in possession of. There was a moment, in the summer of 1887, that Cora thought about often in the years afterward. She was sitting on the porch in the evening, in the particular amber light that Texas does best, with Alina sleeping in her arms and Patrick sitting on the porch steps drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, and Clarence came around the side of the house from the barn and saw her there and stopped walking. He just looked at her for a moment. The light on her face and the sleeping baby and the small boy making his private geography in the dust, and the ranch behind him going about its evening business, and something about the totality of it made him stop moving as if someone had spoken his name from a great distance. She looked up and saw his expression and said, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Everything, I was just looking." She understood. She understood exactly because she felt it too, the vast ordinary improbability of this specific life, and how close she had come to missing it entirely. How many times she had told herself the story of who she was, quiet, overlooked, the girl nobody picks, and how entirely that story had turned out to be wrong, or at least incomplete. She had been wrong about herself. And she was glad, profoundly and daily glad, that Clarence Doyle had walked into Haverfield's general store for rope and salt on an April morning in 1882, and heard 4 words that had lodged themselves in his chest like a splinter of truth that needed removing. She had told herself no one would pick her. She had been telling herself that story for so long she had forgotten it was a story and not a fact. He had stood in that store and heard those words and felt something crack open in his understanding of the world, and then he had come back, and kept coming back, and asked her to supper and then to walk, and then to tell him what she wanted and then to give him a chance and then to marry him. And at every step she had been terrified, and at every step he had waited patiently, and at every step she had chosen, actively chosen, to move forward, which was the part she was proudest of. He had proven her wrong, but she had let him. That was the part that mattered. She looked at Clarence standing in the evening light looking at her like she was the thing he had been working toward without knowing it, and she said, "Come sit with us." He came and sat beside her on the porch, and the light went on turning and the baby slept, and Patrick described the geography he was making in the dirt with complete seriousness, and the evening settled around them like something entirely earned. By 1888, the Doyle Ranch had 2,300 acres under careful management, a line of cattle that had developed a good regional reputation, and a household that operated with the kind of organized warmth that happens when two capable and equally committed people decide to build something together and mean it. Clarence's two original year-round hands, a man named Davies and a younger man named Abe, had become something close to family in the way that the West sometimes produced, that proximity and shared work version of belonging that did not need to be named to be real. Patrick at 5 had strong opinions about horses and no patience for sitting still, which made him his father's constant shadow on the weekends. Eleanor, at 2, had strong opinions about everything and the vocabulary to express them, which made her in some ways the most formidable person in the house. Cora watched her daughter with a particular private delight, seeing in her the fierce certainty of a girl who had never been told to be smaller, who had grown up knowing from the very beginning that she was chosen and kept and irreplaceable. She would not say what Cora had said in that store, this daughter. She would not say it because the thought would not occur to her. And this was one of the most significant things Clarence Doyle had done, without ever explicitly knowing he was doing it. He had made a home in which that particular story could not take root. Cora told him this once. They were lying awake in the early morning in that quiet hour before the house woke up, and she told him she had been thinking about it. He listened, as he always listened, with his full attention. "She's not going to think that about herself," Cora said. "Eleanor. She's never going to stand in a store and say nobody picks the quiet girl as if it's the settled truth of her life. Neither are you," he said. "Not anymore." "I say it differently now," she said. "When I think about it, I think nobody used to pick the quiet girl and then the right person did and it turned out the story was wrong from the beginning." "I'd say I picked you," he said, "but honestly you picked me too. You said yes. You trusted me when you had very good reasons not to trust easily. You moved towards something that scared you. That's not passive, that's an active choice." She was quiet for a moment. "I was so afraid," she said. "In the beginning." "I know," he said. "You were brave anyway." She turned and looked at him in the early light, this man who had known her long enough to understand her completely and loved her specifically because of what he understood rather than despite it. She had not thought this was possible. She had revised her understanding of what was possible thoroughly and gratefully. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you," he said, in the same way, as if it were a plain fact about the world like the price of flour or the distance between towns, which was exactly right. The morning came up gold through the windows, and Eleanor's voice started from down the hall with the energetic morning authority of a 2-year-old who sees no reason that anyone should still be sleeping, and Patrick's footsteps crossed the floor above with the enthusiasm of a boy who has remembered that today he was promised a ride with his father, and the house woke up around them. Cora Donnelly Doyle got up and went to her daughter. Clarence got up and called to his son. The ranch went about its morning in the way of things that are solidly, sustainably alive. And the story that Cora had told herself for so many years, the one about quiet girls and nobody picking them and certain futures being closed off and certain love being unavailable to certain kinds of people, that story was so thoroughly disproven by the actual shape of her actual life that she could barely remember it anymore, which was, in the end, exactly as it should be. There was no trick to it, she had come to understand. No secret formula. It had required a man willing to pay attention to someone the room was not paying attention to, and a woman willing to believe, eventually and with considerable difficulty, that the attention was real. It had required both of them being exactly as afraid as they were, and moving toward each other anyway. They celebrated their 6th anniversary in October of 1888 with a supper at home instead of the hotel dining room, because the hotel had changed ownership and the new cook was inferior, and they both agreed on this without discussion. Cora made a roasted chicken with herbs from the garden, and Clarence procured a bottle of wine with considerably less self-consciousness than he had for their first date, having had 6 years of practice in procuring things he wanted without apologizing for wanting them, which was a quality she admired in him and had been quietly learning from. Patrick ate his supper with the focused efficiency of a 5-year-old who has somewhere more important to be, which was anywhere he could convince his father to take him, and Alina ate hers with the expansive ceremony of a 2-year-old who understood that meals were events requiring comment. And after the children were in bed, Cora and Clarence sat on the porch with the last of the wine and looked out at the range in the dark and said very little, because they had gotten very good at the particular luxury of silence between two people who know each other well enough to be quiet together. "Same time next year," he said. She looked at him. There was something in his voice. "Are you asking me something specific?" He had the look of a man who has been thinking something through. "I'm thinking that the family is a good size as it is, and I'm also thinking that it might be a good size with one more, eventually. But I'm not deciding that. I'm asking." She considered this with the careful attention she brought to important things. Patrick and Alina and the life they had built, and the question of whether there was room and energy and love for more, which she suspected she knew the answer to but wanted to be sure she was answering from the right place and not from habit or expectation. "Ask me again in the spring," she said. "If I feel the same way then as I do right now, my answer will be yes." He nodded. He was good at waiting. He had always been good at waiting. She looked out at the dark range and the enormous Texas sky full of stars that she had watched shift and wheel through 4 seasons now from this specific porch, her porch, the porch of the house where she belonged, and felt the deep, unshakable rightness of it settle through her. She had said nobody picks the quiet girl. She had said it in a general store on an April morning with the certainty of someone stating a law of nature, something fixed and inevitable and not worth arguing against. She had been magnificently, completely, specifically wrong. She was glad about that every day. She intended to keep being glad about it for the rest of her life, which she planned to spend here, on this ranch with this man, teaching the children of Dusty Creek growing things in the kitchen garden, riding out in the spring when the bluebonnets came up across the range and the sky was so vast and so blue that it looked like God had decided to overdo it on purpose. She would tell Alina someday, not as a cautionary tale or a lesson, but as a story. The kind of story that starts in a general store with 4 words said to a busybody behind a bolt of calico, and ends, if you're paying attention and brave enough to move toward what scares you, in exactly the right place. In the spring of 1890, they had their 3rd child, another son, smaller and calmer than Patrick had been and given from the beginning to sitting quietly with a very focused expression on his face, studying whatever was in front of him with intensity. They named him James, for no particular reason except that it suited him, and he grew into a boy who had his mother's observational quality and his father's patience, which was a remarkable combination in a small person. Patrick, now 7, received his brother with the exasperated tolerance of a boy who had wanted another partner in active adventure, and received instead a baby who seemed more interested in watching things than doing them. Alina, now 4 and fully herself, received James with a possessive maternal instinct that surprised everyone including Cora, and spent considerable effort explaining the world to her baby brother whether he wanted the explanation or not. The ranch was good. The cattle were healthy. The land was paid off, and improving every year under careful management. The school in Dusty Creek continued, staffed by Miss Farrow and a newer second teacher, and Cora maintained her connection to it, consulted on curriculum and attended school board meetings with the calm authority of someone who had fought for that institution and knew it well. Dusty Creek grew in small ways through the end of the decade, new families coming in, a second general store opening, the post office expanding its hours, the small things that marked a place building on itself. The world was changing around the edges of the West. The railroad was pushing further and further into places that had been remote, and new technologies and new ideas were arriving with it. And Cora read about all of it with her characteristic attention and talked to Clarence about it in the evenings. And they navigated the changing world together the same way they navigated everything, with honest conversation and shared decision-making and the bedrock of genuine trust. They were in each other's corner, completely and without reservation. This was the fact that Cora returned to when she needed something solid, and she never found it insufficient. Patrick grew up and learned the cattle business from his father, the way boys learn things when the father is patient and present, gradually and deeply, by doing rather than by being told. Alina grew up to be exactly the person she had always been at too, fierce and direct and brilliantly certain of herself, and went east for 2 years of proper education when she was 17 and came back to Texas with a head full of new ideas and the settled intention of doing something significant with them, which surprised no one who had ever met her. James grew up quietly and eventually became a very good doctor, which suited him so precisely that in retrospect it seemed inevitable. But that is all in the future, and for now it is enough to say that in the summer of 1890, Cora Donnelly Doyle stood on the ridge at the eastern edge of the Doyle Ranch with her husband beside her and looked out at miles of open Texas range, and knew herself to be in the exact right life, the one that had started with her saying something sad in a general store and someone listening. She had been wrong about so many things. She was grateful for every one of them. The cattleman had proven her wrong. The quiet girl had let him. And out of those 2 small facts, 2 people with walls and histories and carefully managed expectations had built something extraordinary, which was an ordinary life, fully and wonderfully lived.